The order came through the wall of glass like a ripple across the training hall, a pale blue directive blooming over the cadets' heads and washing the floor in soft light that smelled faintly of ionized air. Mason had come to the Galactic Academy expecting exams with mathematics dense enough to fold his skull or combat drills that would leave his lungs tasting of metal. He had not expected a shelter drill to command the attention of an entire wing, yet as the message scrolled, every conversation snapped shut as if a knife had been dragged across a taut rope. The drill would last 48 hours. No sleeping on the ground, no prefab components, no powered tools beyond the universal field knife. The site, a humid jungle moon with high winds and nocturnal predators that hunted by sound and heat. The hall hummed as cadets compared reactions. An arthropodic team from VHX clicked mandibles in a bright rhythm that meant confidence. A pair of wing-shouldered gliders stretched flight membranes against the vents as if warming up for applause. A vine walker from the temperate belts wound root hair across his forearms, flexing a lattice of green tendons for anyone willing to watch. Mason kept his hands in his jacket and read the rest. Sleeping on the ground was not forbidden for cruelty. It was a constraint the instructors had learned the hard way. The last group to touch leaf litter had woken to a carnivore the size of a truck nosing against a tarp with a mouthful of rotary teeth. He remembered the brief, the way the words did not dramatize what had happened. One cadet had lived. She had slept above the ground in a sling built from her duty uniform and a web of fibers teased from bark. She had suffered exposure and infection, but she had lived, and that had been enough for a rule to crystallize into a tradition. The attendant who wore brass pins moved along the line and handed out the standard kits. The bag felt light, almost insulting, as if the academy wanted to teach humility by omission. He counted without looking. Paracord in a tight hank, a micropot that could ride a flame, a water filter the size of a finger bone, a carbon steel knife he already trusted, and a whetstone he did not. No tarp, no poles, no netting. The attendant smiled at a glider and murmured encouragement. She glanced at Mason as if checking a box and moved on. He listened to the giddy arrogance of the hall absorb the rules and bend them into personal victory speeches. A glider promised his partner that a high perch would keep danger out. An arthropod who stood on 6 legs bragged that he could carry half a tree to the site. The vine walker chuckled and told anyone within earshot that the jungle was already his bed, that a living branch knew how to hold a body if asked with the right pressure. Mason tried to avoid hearing the human assumptions that always lined up as if to become a chorus. Humans lacked specializations. Humans compensated with gadgets. Humans were charmingly stubborn and catastrophically fragile. He did not dislike the academy for this. He liked the way it made him memorize that charm was not a tool. He liked the way the place insisted on showing him the edges of his skill without caring if his feelings got snagged. He thought of his aunt's barn in the Adirondacks and the way his uncle had made him string 2 trees with a line until his hands bled tiny, neat stars. His uncle had shown him the knots that held tension without choking the rope, and the knots that released with 2 taps even when soaked and frozen. He had taught him that a hammock was not a pouch, but a system, that the line angles mattered, that the lay of the body mattered, that the wind grabbed anything sloppy, and that sloppiness was just an admission of divided attention. He had fallen asleep in July rain, listening to water patter across leaves and into improvised eaves he had trained with a few folds and a stick. He remembered waking dry and warm with breath making a bubble of heat in the cold, the world nested in small successes. An instructor cleared his throat and the room dropped to a lower register, respectful without quite becoming silent. The man's coat had salt and iron trim and a collar high enough to frame a face that had not learned to smile unless the lesson needed it. He introduced the drill in clipped phrases, the way a surgeon might discuss a procedure. The predators tracked through 3 senses: thermals, certain acids, and rhythm. The canopy twisted under gusts. The tree bark bled sap when cut, and the sap pulled insects. The ground was soft in some places and deceptive in others. A woman stood beside him with a tablet that mapped the site in spirals and color bands. She explained that storms moved at night as if dragged by a chain, and that branches which looked thick in the afternoon might be sailcloth once the wind stood up. Mason watched 3 details and tested a 4th. The storm pattern meant windbreaks mattered more than height. The sap meant fresh cuts would announce a body like a flare. The acids meant sweat had to be handled or disguised. He asked himself which trees were sisters and which were strangers. The trees with roots that braided across trunks were bonded. The trees that grew alone grew brittle. His instructor, the man with the salt and iron trim, looked at him for half a second longer than the glance he had given the vine walker, as if trying to read whether this particular human had any clever the Academy had not yet catalogued. He looked away before the glance could become recognition. The shuttle down was supposed to be routine, but the pilot hit the atmosphere at an angle that made the view outside the port smear into orange streaks. The vine walker who had laughed earlier gripped his harness and swore softly in his own language, a sound like wet rope slipping over wood. The gliders rolled their shoulders and flexed elbow spurs as if imagining leaping from the hatch into a friendly updraft, though the briefing had said the gusts here could pin a membrane to a tree and hold a body flat. Mason closed his eyes and let the judder work through him. He pretended he was back in the barn with the rafters making their patient angles overhead and a mouse squeaking somewhere with the outraged dignity of small kings. The jungle slammed up under the shuttle with the force of a wall and then became a rush of green, dark veins pressed thick across the skin of a planet that did not want company. He caught the smell as the hatch opened, a swampy sweetness that said the night would be busy. The instructors walked the perimeter of the landing zone while the cadets trotted out with the bravado of a parade. The salt and iron man lifted a small cone and blew a thin note that made Mason's teeth itch. That was the start tone. The clock stood up when that sound cut through the canopy. Mason did not run. Running at the beginning of a 48-hour problem was an apology for not thinking. He let the others sprint and claim showy trees. He walked until the landing zone blur thinned into layered noise, and he could hear one predator who called like a bell hung too low, and another who dragged syllables across the top of his lungs as if he enjoyed the friction. He found a place where 3 trees had grown as a unit, their crowns touching like comrades who never stopped talking. He set his hand on a trunk and felt for the way it gave back. It flexed along a line that promised a little bounce but no snap. He pressed his ear to the wood and heard the wind as it shook itself out into ropes. He liked the way this cluster talked to itself. He liked how the lines ran. Around him, the drama escalated in 100 small acts. A glider jumped to a branch and cut it by instinct with a short blade, then swore as sap surged and a glitter of insects rose like breath from a sleeping mouth. An arthropod set 4 legs and lifted a log that groaned under his weight, then pivoted until the log jammed into a crook and moaned like a door with stories. The vine walker unrolled a living cord of plant fiber and asked it to climb. But the vine met a different family and unlaced itself as if insulted. Mason counted his breaths and uncoiled paracord to soothe the small animal that woke in his hands whenever a problem was neat enough to invite craft. He threw the first line without fanfare and caught a limb as thick as a torso, then paid out a second line across to the partner tree, then a third line back to anchor the angle. He did not cut anything that bled. He used friction hitches that wanted to hold and backed every knot with a simple half hitch that made the system forgive small mistakes. He had learned to think of hammocks as diagonals with manners, not as cradles. He set the hang shallow, not like a smile but like a serious mouth. He checked the wind and lowered one side to break gusts. He tested the lay with his body and let the rope tell him the truth. The Academy had briefed this as a brutal exercise in scarcity, but at that height, he could feel abundance, air that moved, wood that breathed, a spectrum of sounds that warned him before anything arrived. He did not want to be clever in a way that created problems for his future self. He wanted to be obvious and durable. When he dropped to the ground to fetch a fallen branch that had hardened into the right kind of tool, a shadow moved at the edge of his vision. He looked but did not turn his head, and his eyes caught a predator shouldering past a fern with the lazy arrogance of an apex that had never needed to learn hurry. The thing looked toward the gliders who had made noise, then looked toward the landing zone where the smell of foreign sweat had pooled, and then moved away as if deciding boredom was a resource worth protecting. He stood very still until his heart found an old rhythm. He climbed back up and finished the anchor for a second sling, because the first rule of a good night was redundancy. A female instructor walked under his tree and glanced up through leaves. She was the one with the tablet. She had the expression of a woman measuring a doorway before moving a couch. She did not call up or ask questions. She wrote something small with her stylus and moved on. The day shifted toward evening, and the light lost its temperature. The jungle made the sound he had heard once on a beach when the tide changed. He could sense the impatience building in the branches where the gliders had stretched membranes in shelters that would flap at the first push of air. He could sense the fatigue in the legs of the arthropod as he braced his platform with a scaffold that tried to argue with wind instead of having a conversation. The vine-walker sang into his wrist and asked his living cords to forgive his earlier arrogance. Mason tightened one line, then another, and stopped when the system hummed with the quiet music of tension set right. He lay back and looked through leaves at a sky that would be violent and exquisite by midnight. He had 28 minutes left before the Academy would call the build phase complete and declare the night on. He closed his eyes and let his uncle's barn tilt into this place, rafters becoming branches, a boy becoming a cadet, a summer ritual becoming a wager with weather and teeth. He did not feel heroic. He felt like a man waiting for the moment where planning and mercy met and shook hands. Rain began with no warning, a straight fall of heavy drops that slid off the upper canopy and drummed against every surface like the slow tapping of fingers on a table. The light turned a dull green, and the air thickened as if the jungle were drawing a deep breath before speaking. Mason stayed still for a long moment, listening to how the forest adjusted. Some cadets shouted over the noise, their voices strained and competitive, as if the weather were just another test of endurance. He knew better. In the jungle, sound carried, and shouting meant more than just communication. It was an announcement to every living thing with ears. He scanned the spaces between trunks where movement meant more than shape. A glider clung to a branch, his wing membranes sagging with collected rainwater, struggling to shake it off without tearing the delicate edges. Not far away, an arthropod cadet wrestled with a section of fallen trunk, trying to prop it into position as part of a platform. The rain slicked the wood until his clawed grip kept slipping, and the structure leaned under its own weight. Further off, the vine-walker shifted from foot to foot on a half-built lattice that sagged more with every drop of water. None of them seemed to notice how the rain changed the forest's smell, how the scent of fresh cuts and exposed sap grew stronger, how it would carry farther through the damp air. Mason did not call out. Advice given in the middle of work was rarely welcome, and most would only hear the challenge, not the lesson. Instead, he checked the lines of his own setup, tugging at the knots to feel if the paracord had loosened under the damp. The ropes felt tighter, the fibers swelling with moisture, which was what he wanted. The hammock swayed lightly in the wind, rain shedding down the angled cords in thin streams that dripped away harmlessly before reaching the bedding surface. He adjusted a leaf panel to catch more water in his collection flask and made sure the angle of the sling would keep his back from pressing into a cold, wet spot during the night. Overhead, the jungle canopy shifted, letting in flashes of pale light as branches moved. That movement was not all wind. He caught the ripple of leaves too deliberate to be random. Something up there was pacing along a branch, careful not to break it. The sound came in bursts, like small weights pressing on the wood in measured steps. He kept his head tilted as if adjusting his cord, letting his eyes slide toward the noise without jerking. When the shape came into view, it was only for a heartbeat, fur patterned in a wash of dark and pale stripes, body low to the surface, tail curled for balance. The predator was too far to be a direct threat right now, but close enough to be aware of everything in this section of the forest. It was not hunting yet. It was learning. Mason decided to keep all movements quiet for the rest of the build period. He worked slower, checking his surroundings between each adjustment. In the clearing beyond, the arthropod cadet cursed in frustration as his structure sagged and broke under its own weight. One section of the log fell heavily to the ground, sending a deep thud through the earth. Mason saw the predator's ears twitch in the canopy above, head turning toward the sound. The arthropod started again, unaware of the attention he had just drawn. A female instructor walked along the forest floor, her boots moving with the silence of someone trained to blend with the environment. She looked up occasionally, studying each cadet's progress. When her gaze passed over Mason's work, she lingered a second longer, not because the structure was grand, but because it was finished and stable. She made a note on her slate and moved on, calling out to the glider cadet to lower his shelter before the wind turned his perch into a sail. The rain intensified, becoming a sheet that blurred the outlines of the world. Mason took the opportunity to adjust his second sling, shifting it so it could hold more than one person without tipping. He was not doing it out of charity, but because in situations like this, the odds of someone abandoning their own shelter were high, and extra space meant he could control who shared his. If he chose to let someone in, it would be because it made sense, not because panic forced the decision. Thunder rolled in the distance, long and low, and the wind shifted with it, carrying the scent of damp fur. He knew the predator had moved closer, using the rain and noise as cover. The glider's voice cut through the air again, calling for help as one of his anchor branches began to splinter. Mason did not move toward him. He knew the instructors would step in if real danger struck. Part of the drill was to learn that not every problem was yours to solve. Instead, he checked his fire setup. The Dakota hole was shallow and angled to draw air even in the rain, lined with small stones to hold heat. Smoke rose thinly and dispersed quickly under the leaves, carrying the scent away from his position. The jungle dimmed further, shadows deepening as the storm took full hold. The forest floor began to flood in shallow pools, and Mason saw more than one cadet scramble to move supplies higher, cursing as water seeped into gear. He had positioned his storage high from the start, wrapped in waxed cloth and balanced in a fork of branches. Now he only needed to tighten one rope and watch as others struggled to imitate the same idea under pressure. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, sharp and final, followed by the heavy rustle of something moving fast. A shout went up, cut short into a cry. The instructor's signal whistles followed, calling cadets to stay put and not intervene. The sound faded, replaced by the hiss of rain and the occasional groan of a wind-bent trunk. Mason stayed where he was, one hand resting on the cord above him, the other on the hilt of his knife. He breathed slowly, matching the rhythm of the swaying trees, waiting for the moment when the light would shift again and the jungle would show him its next move. The build phase was almost over, but the real test, the long hours of the night, was only just beginning. The storm eased with the slow reluctance of a tired opponent, the rain tapering into thin threads that slipped from the canopy and vanished into the damp air before touching the ground. Mason took the quiet as permission to move, lowering himself to the main platform with a steady grip on the rope. The air smelled richer now, heavy with the earthy scent of moss and the sharp tang of wet bark. He could hear the forest adjusting, the faint clicks and rustles of life re-emerging after the downpour. Somewhere nearby, an insect began its high, rhythmic call, answered almost immediately by another farther away. He knew these weren't just background sounds. They were signals, warnings, and acknowledgments passing between unseen creatures. Below his position, the arthropod cadet sat hunched beside the remains of his failed structure. The log he had tried to use lay at an awkward angle, half submerged in a growing pool of water. His shoulders twitched with irritation as he scraped mud from his claws. Mason could tell he was too proud to abandon the project, but also too stubborn to change his approach. A few meters away, the vine walker was climbing a tree again, this time slower, testing each step with care. The living fibers around his arms tightened and loosened in small adjustments, as if learning from earlier mistakes. The glider cadet had managed to pull his damaged shelter down to a lower height, but it now sagged badly, barely above the danger zone that the instructors had warned about. Mason shifted his attention back to his own work. The second sling was secured and tensioned, the ropes running cleanly between anchor points without sagging under the damp. He pulled out a strip of cloth from his kit, rubbing it along the ropes to remove excess water before the fibers swelled too much. The stability was good, but he wanted it perfect. A shelter that failed at 3 in the morning was worse than no shelter at all. He checked his water collection system next. The large leaf he had positioned earlier was still channeling drops into the flask, though the rate had slowed now that the rain was light. He repositioned the leaf to catch more from the canopy's edge, using a thin vine to hold the angle. It was a small adjustment, but the kind that paid off over hours. Movement on the forest floor caught his attention. A female instructor was making her way between shelters, her eyes sweeping the area with quick, sharp glances. When she reached the arthropod cadet, she stopped, speaking in a low voice he couldn't make out over the hum of the forest. The cadet answered with a flick of his head and a clack of his mandibles, his tone curt. She remained there for a moment longer, then turned away without argument, heading toward the glider's position. Mason watched her stop again, this time pointing at the sagging shelter and gesturing upward as if giving an instruction about reinforcement. The glider's response was more cooperative, though his body language carried the same weariness that hung over most of the group now. The day's light was fading quickly, the thick clouds from the storm speeding the onset of darkness. Mason knew this was the most dangerous transition period, when the day's work might still be unfinished, but the night's threats were already awake. He heard a distant, low growl that was more vibration than sound, followed by the snapping of a branch somewhere in the mid-canopy. The noise wasn't close enough to be immediate danger, but it was a reminder that the predators here didn't need much time to close distance. He moved back to his primary sling and made a final check on its alignment. The angle was shallow enough to keep his weight distributed, the knots still tight, the anchor trees steady under his testing push. He stepped back and looked at the entire setup from a short distance, evaluating it as if it belonged to someone else. The structure had balance, redundancy, and concealment, everything he would need for the coming night. The rest of the cadets were not so lucky. He could hear more muttered curses from the arthropod, a strained grunt from the vine walker as he tried to tie off a swaying section of his platform, and the soft, frustrated sighs of the glider as he adjusted cords that refused to hold their tension. Mason knew from experience that the hardest part was still ahead. Night in this kind of environment wasn't just about staying dry or hidden. It was about keeping the mind steady when every sound hinted at something moving closer. He pulled his pack closer to his sling, unfastening the waxed cloth covering to check his supplies. The contents were dry: the small pot, the filter, the extra cord, and the fire-starting kit. He packed them back neatly, then tied the pack to the inner line of his shelter so it would be within reach even if he woke in the middle of the night. A flicker of movement in the corner of his vision made him turn his head slowly. Up in the branches, just far enough to be concealed by leaves, a pair of pale eyes reflected the last of the day's light. The shape was motionless, watching. Mason didn't tense. He knew that sudden movement could draw curiosity into aggression. Instead, he bent to check the cord at his feet, keeping the creature in his peripheral vision. After a few breaths, the eyes blinked and disappeared into the dark, the sound of its departure masked by the rustling of leaves. He climbed back into his sling, lying diagonally to distribute his weight, one hand resting lightly on the cord above him. The forest around him was shifting into its night rhythm now, deep, layered sounds, some constant, some fleeting. The air felt heavier, the damp pressing in from all directions. He closed his eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to listen more carefully, mapping the positions of the cadets around him by the sounds of their movements. The vine walker was still working, though slower now, his weight making the branches creak in regular intervals. The glider's shelter groaned softly in the wind. The arthropod had gone silent, perhaps retreating into whatever partial cover he had managed to salvage. Mason opened his eyes again and looked up into the darkness above, where the canopy swayed like a living ceiling. The preparation phase was over. From here on, the night would decide whose planning held and whose confidence would break first. The night settled over the jungle like a slow tide, pulling away the last fragments of daylight and replacing them with a dense, layered darkness. The air grew cooler but no less heavy, carrying the damp scent of wet leaves and the sharp mineral tang of soil stirred by the storm. Mason lay still in his sling, his body angled just enough to see through a small gap in the canopy where pale starlight slipped through. He knew that the first few hours of night were the most dangerous, not because predators were hungriest then, but because everything in the forest was awake and shifting position. It was a period of adjustment, of territories being re-established after the rain had forced animals into unfamiliar shelters. Far below, the arthropod cadet moved with jerky, heavy steps, clearly trying to find a better position without drawing attention. The sound of his weight pressing into the saturated ground carried upward, each step a muted thump, followed by the soft suction of waterlogged soil. Mason tracked the noise until it stopped near a large tree root, where the cadet seemed to settle. He doubted the position would hold. Roots were good for breaking up a silhouette, but rarely offered enough elevation to keep out of reach. A faint rustle to his left drew Mason's attention. The glider was adjusting his sagging shelter again, the cords creaking softly as he tried to redistribute his weight. Mason could hear the shallow, steady breathing that came with focused effort, the occasional grunt when a knot refused to budge. The vine walker had gone quiet, his position somewhere behind Mason's right shoulder, hidden by a tangle of thick foliage. In the distance, deeper into the forest, a predator called out, a low, resonant note that seemed to vibrate through the trees themselves. The sound was answered by another, closer than Mason would have liked. He knew from the briefings that these calls weren't always meant for coordination. Sometimes they were just reminders, warnings that the territory was already claimed. He kept his breathing slow, listening for the subtle shift in the forest's rhythm that would tell him if something was closing in. A gust of wind pushed through the canopy, making the branches sway and sending a scattering of raindrops down onto his sling. He reached up and adjusted the cord above him, ensuring the water collection leaf stayed angled correctly. It was a small movement, but in the stillness it felt loud. Somewhere below, a twig snapped. The sound was quick, sharp, and unmistakable. Not the slow break of rotting wood underwater, but the clean fracture of something stepping where it shouldn't. Mason's eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any hint of reflection or movement. For a long moment nothing appeared, and he began to wonder if it had been one of the other cadets shifting position. Then he saw it. Two faint glimmers of pale light, low to the ground, slowly closing the distance toward the arthropod's position. Mason stayed silent. Intervening now would do nothing but alert the predator that its approach had been noticed. The arthropod shifted slightly, either unaware of the danger or unwilling to acknowledge it. The predator paused, its eyes fixed on the movement, then began a slow, deliberate arc to the side. Mason recognized the tactic, testing for a better angle of approach. A whistle cut through the night, sharp and short, from one of the instructors. The sound was enough to make the predator freeze, then melt back into the undergrowth without a sound. Mason exhaled quietly, his grip on the cord above him loosening. The forest seemed to settle again, though the tension lingered like a faint electric charge in the air. He shifted his focus back to his own position, tightening the secondary line on his sling to make sure it would hold if more weight was added. He had seen too many drills fail when one person's poorly built shelter collapsed and sent them scrambling toward someone else's. Better to be ready. Time passed in slow, measured fragments. The glider's shelter groaned occasionally in the wind, and the vine walker's position remained unnervingly silent. Mason adjusted his hearing to the forest's night sounds, the clicking of small insects, the rustle of something light moving across a branch, the distant drip of water finding a new path through the canopy. Then a new sound reached him, a faint rhythmic scratching coming from directly below. He leaned slightly over the edge of the sling, careful not to shift his balance too much, and peered down. At first he saw nothing. Then the shape resolved. A long-bodied creature with powerful forelimbs, its claws working steadily into the base of the tree. It wasn't hunting him directly, but the digging suggested it was after something that had taken shelter in the roots. He watched as it worked for several minutes, then lost interest and padded away, disappearing into the dark. The interruption had left him more alert, his senses sharpened. He checked the position of his knife again, ensuring it was within easy reach, and then settled back into the sling. The night would be long, but so far his preparations had kept him secure. The real question was how the others would fare when exhaustion set in, and their structures were tested by more than just wind and rain. Above him, the stars shifted slightly in the gap between branches, a reminder that time was passing, even if the darkness made it feel otherwise. Somewhere in the forest, another predator's call rang out, this one farther away. Mason closed his eyes briefly, listening to the way the sound rolled through the trees, and prepared himself for whatever the rest of the night might bring. The first light of dawn came not as a sudden flood, but as a slow lifting of the darkness, a pale wash that seeped between the branches and softened the edges of the jungle. Mason had not truly slept. Though his body had drifted in and out of shallow rest, every sense alert to changes in sound or movement. The air was cooler now, the oppressive weight of humidity replaced by a thin morning chill. He stretched slowly in the sling, careful not to shift its balance, and scanned the forest floor. Below, the arthropod cadet was already moving, his long legs stepping carefully over the damp ground as he gathered his scattered gear. His shelter, if it could still be called that, had collapsed sometime during the night, leaving him exposed but apparently unhurt. The glider's position was empty. Mason's eyes tracked along the branches until he found him perched on a lower limb, wings folded tight, staring at the ground as if calculating a route down. The vine walker emerged from a dense knot of foliage, his living cords draped limply over his shoulders, their movements sluggish with fatigue. None of them looked rested. Mason's own shelter had held perfectly. The lines were still taut, the knots dry where the waxed cord had resisted the rain, and the bedding surface had stayed warm enough through the night to keep the worst of the chill at bay. He untied one end and let the sling fold into itself, coiling the cord neatly as he worked. Every movement was methodical. Habit kept him from rushing, even though he could feel the unspoken tension in the air. The drill might be ending soon, but until the signal came, the environment was still very much real. The instructors began to appear, their boots making almost no sound as they moved through the undergrowth. The female instructor with the slate walked directly to the arthropod cadet, speaking to him in a low tone that made him stiffen and click his mandibles once in acknowledgement. She moved on to the glider, her words brief but accompanied by a small gesture toward Mason's tree. The glider's expression shifted, somewhere between irritation and reluctant respect, before he glanced up at Mason. Mason didn't acknowledge it, simply continuing to pack his kit. A sharp whistle cut through the air, signaling the end of the drill. Relief rippled across the clearing, though it was subdued. Fatigue kept most cadets from celebrating. The instructors began moving between them, making notes, asking short questions, and inspecting whatever remained of the shelters. Mason stayed in place until one of the senior instructors, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running from temple to jaw, stopped beneath his position and looked up. "Come down," the man said, his voice carrying easily without being loud. Mason climbed down with the same steady control he had used all night, dropping lightly onto the damp earth. The instructor's eyes flicked over the coil of cord in Mason's hands and then to the still intact anchors above. "Yours held," the man observed. It wasn't a question. Mason gave a short nod. It worked. The instructor made a mark on his datapad and stepped aside, allowing him to walk toward the gathering point where the other cadets were assembling. As they stood in a loose half-circle, the lead instructor addressed them. His words were measured, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent of critique. He spoke of the importance of adaptability, of designing with the environment instead of against it, and of understanding that speed did not mean rushing. It meant knowing exactly what to do and wasting no energy in doing it. His gaze lingered on Mason briefly when he spoke of efficiency, then moved on. The evaluation came next. One by one, the instructors called each cadet forward, commenting on performance, pointing out strengths and weaknesses. When Mason's turn came, the female instructor with the slate stepped forward. "Your shelter was the only one that maintained full integrity through the night," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "You built quickly, with minimal waste, and accounted for redundancy. You also maintained concealment and resource management. This is the standard." She paused for a moment, as if deciding whether to add something more. "However," she continued, "you did not assist others whose shelters failed." Mason met her gaze evenly. It wasn't part of the brief. Her expression didn't change, but she made another mark on the slate. "Noted," she said before dismissing him. The rest of the evaluations were mixed. Some cadets had shown creative designs that failed under stress. Others had chosen solid locations but wasted too much time in construction. A few had relied too heavily on natural abilities, underestimating how the jungle could turn those same advantages into liabilities. When it was over, the group was instructed to board the waiting transport. As they moved toward the landing zone, Mason glanced back at the site. The 3 trees he had chosen stood quiet, their branches swaying slightly in the morning breeze. The slings were gone now, but the anchors remained, a faint trace of the night's work. He felt no surge of pride, no need to mark the moment beyond remembering it. This was training, nothing more, but the kind that stayed with you, sharpening edges you didn't know you had. The shuttle lifted off, the jungle shrinking beneath them until it became a patchwork of greens and shadows. Mason leaned back in his seat, letting the hum of the engines replace the layered sounds of the forest. The drill was over. He had done what needed to be done, nothing more, nothing less. In the quiet space of his own mind, he knew that was exactly how he intended to approach the next challenge, whatever form it took.